we are moving from Greece, Egypt, and the Middle East all the way up to Britain to meet a man named Pelagius, although we're still in a very early time frame in the 4th century. Pelagius was a theologian, but not a priest, and had no formal religious authority from the church. Although he was very well educated, his time was not spent in the ivory towers of academia, but living simply among the people of the British Isles, beloved as sort of a kind of spiritual director for clergy and for laity alike, advising those from all strata of society on how to live a godly life. We actually have very little of his writing, but we know a lot about what he believed from the response of his critics. In particular, his ideas got under the skin of his contemporary Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, who we know a lot about and who wrote a lot about, and a lot of it was directed at Pelagius. St. Augustine actually made it a personal mission to have Pelagius declared a heretic and publish screeds and convene councils against Pelagius until he got his wish. Still, however, Pelagius never saw the inside of a prison cell or the eyes of an executioner, and ended his days in peace, protected by St. Cyril, the Bishop of Alexandria, no doubt as Augustine fumed at that protection over in Hippo. The protection of Cyril is notable because Cyril was a pretty aggressive hunter of heretics himself, but he did not put Pelagius in that category. I want to look at Pelagius because in his thinking, we find a debate within the early church that touches almost every debate that will come later. It's a fork in the road that, once taken, points the way towards different sets of conclusions to other theological divides that underlie Christian arguments and denominational differences right here in the 21st century. John Wesley agreed with Pelagius, so let's peel off some layers and go back to that 4th century fork in the road. Like the Gnostics we visited last week, Pelagius encouraged a sparse, ascetic lifestyle, but for very different reasons than the Gnostics. The Gnostics shunned bodily comforts because they believed physical matter was either an obstacle to be overcome to free their inner spirits, or that it was entirely illusion in the first place and physical matter wasn't real and therefore deserved to be ignored. Pelagius, on the other hand, encouraged asceticism because he thought the idea of God's grace made Christians lazy. That same point has been made at many points across Christian history. In the 20th century, German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer coined the term cheap grace to represent those who don't think how we live our lives really matters because God will just forgive us if we say we're sorry. Cheap grace is a theology that believes grace is costly, but only for Jesus, who had to die to give it to us, but then not consequentially for us. Grace is amazing in that view, largely because it's so easy. No need to put extra effort into trying to be a better person. You can just be forgiven and start again tomorrow or next week or whenever it feels convenient. The phrase, well, I'm only human, when used as an excuse for bad behavior, is a contemporary manifestation of cheap grace theology, or what Pelagius would call lazy Christianity. I picked a rather fractured set of Bible verses from Romans 5 and 6 this morning, because Pelagius spent a lot of time in that part of Romans, and specifically those verses, but especially focused on the question at the end of the set of verses that Kathy read last. the first 2 verses of Romans 6. Earlier in Romans, Paul has been talking about the wondrous nature of God's grace for several chapters. The notion that he, Paul, could be forgiven by God's grace, that he didn't have to earn his salvation, was the fuel that directed Paul's zeal away from hunting those he previously viewed as heretics, the Jewish followers of Jesus, and toward the spreading the news of that amazing grace across the globe. Those same early chapters of Romans totally altered the life of Martin Luther, who responded by altering the religious landscape in all of Europe with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Martin Luther then wrote a commentary on the book of Romans, which John Wesley heard read aloud by some Moravians at a low point in his life, 2 centuries after Luther. And in hearing the section on Romans 3, that idea of not having to earn God's favor, but receiving admission into the circle of God's care as a gift from God instead, grace, reached right down into John Wesley's soul, and he wrote in his journal the famous words that his heart had been, what? Strangely warmed, for people who were here this spring. He then proceeded to change England as a tireless champion for social reform, and then brought the movement to the United States, where his method spread like wildfire. And here we are, Methodists. During the 4th century, the North African bishop of Hippo, St. Augustine, was having his own life transformed by that same section of Romans 3. It doesn't appear that Pelagius had any issues with those initial chapters in the book of Romans. But Pelagius saw in them a danger Paul also saw and expressed right at the start of Romans 6. What then are we to say? Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? Already in Paul's lifetime, a life that ended with the pointy end of a sword took off his head on the orders of the Roman Emperor Nero in about 64-65 AD, Paul could see that bumper sticker faith could lead people away from the whole point of Jesus' life and the core teaching of both Jewish and Christian faith. That the purpose of all God's law and the teaching of all the prophets was to move people, indeed to free people, to be able to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and their neighbors as themselves. To my mind, many of the problems and conflicts that have arisen in Christian theology across time have come because people seem to forget that the book of Romans does not end with chapter 3. In the rush of emotion at realizing that we don't have to earn our way into God's favor, in the overwhelming relief and joy and strange heartwarming that comes with dropping that existential anxiety to embrace a loving God, those who feel that joy most share it with others without reservation. And while it lands with the same force on the personality type of perfectionists like Paul, Augustine, Luther, and Wesley, it can have a different effect on personalities that have never been overly concerned with their behavior in the first place, unless there's a strict enforcement mechanism to keep them in line. Paul is one of the very few scholars who can believe and defend something with zealous intensity and still pull back enough to understand how articulating those beliefs without any nuance to them can lead to problematic outcomes. That's what he's guarding against at the start of Romans 6. Paul recognizes that the absolute, unconditional love of God, given as a gift, not based on merit, can be heard both as life-changing, amazing news to some, and as the best excuse on the planet for doing whatever we want to others. By no means, says Paul, and Pelagius took up that particular cry from Romans 6, even as St. Augustine was writing his confessions in the ecstasy of Romans 3, and landing in the exact places that I think Paul was warning against in 5 and 6. After the fall of Rome to the Visigoths in the year 410, Pelagius went to Africa to basically have it out with Augustine, who denounced Pelagius in several public letters. The short version of the rest of Pelagius' life, to the degree that we know it, is that when it didn't go all that well with Augustine in Africa, Pelagius went to Jerusalem. But Augustine was on his tail, and Pelagius was accused of heresy in Jerusalem in 415. But he managed to exonerate himself in front of the council there. So Augustine then teamed up with Latin biblical scholar St. Jerome to keep the attack going. Pelagius wrote in defense of free will in 416, and that got him condemned by 2 African councils. The following year, Pope Innocent I excommunicated Pelagius, but the Pope died shortly thereafter, and the next Pope, Zosimus, welcomed Pelagius back into the church. So Augustine then organized a council in Carthage in 418, which investigated and condemned Pelagius again, which made Zosimus relent, okay, I'll condemn him too. So Pelagius then goes to Alexandria in Egypt, where Cyril, the bishop there, welcomes him. And Pelagius continues his work there until his death, which was only a few months later. Clearly, Augustine took the claims of Pelagius personally. But it's equally clear that even within the circle of the church's earliest bishops and popes, it wasn't a given that Pelagius was really out of bounds. So what got Augustine so hot under the collar? What was the real threat to him and to others? The claims of Pelagius were twofold. First, Pelagius insisted that human beings were, at their core, good. In other words, he denied original sin. Pelagius found nothing that would contradict the assertion in Genesis 1:31 that God looked at human beings along with all the rest of creation and pronounced the entirety of it very good. Since we don't have much of Pelagius' writing, and since this week I'm on the same side as the heretic for the key issues, I will make the case for his position rather than trying to put words in his mouth. So, on original sin, teaching that eating the fruit in the Garden of Eden somehow erased all the vestiges of that created goodness seems to me like a stretch. Could human beings have such power that we could eradicate the essential goodness that God put into creation? I find zero biblical support for that. We can willfully ignore our essential goodness. We can fall out of practice to such an extent that the image of God within us becomes invisible to others and maybe even to ourselves. But can we actually erase the fundamental nature of creation as good? And the doctrine of original sin goes even farther, trying to tell us that such erasure is epigenetic, and it affects every other human on the planet from Adam on down to this day. Even the most literal reading of the fall and God's curse in Genesis 3 does not make that claim. And while you can get there by proof texting Paul's claims about Jesus, you can't get there from Jesus himself, which, as far as I'm concerned, is required. The importance of that question about the fundamental nature of creation in general and human beings in particular cannot be overstated. If it's not the very first fork in the theological road, it is darn close to it. I think Augustine was so insistent on original sin because his own withering self-examination led him to believe that God's originally created goodness couldn't possibly still exist within him, because he had tried and tried and tried some more, and he couldn't get it right. Paul said in Romans 3 that we were saved by God's grace and not by our own effort, and Augustine was changed by that, let all that baggage go, but then he never moved from Romans 3. Belief in Jesus, who Paul calls a second Adam, could reverse the consequences of what that first Adam had done in the garden and give us a get-out-of-jail-free card. Our works don't save us, which is great news because we keep on sinning. God bails us out with grace. And that's true as far as it goes, but that is only chapter 3. Pelagius saw the work of Jesus as more practical and less magical. To my knowledge, Pelagius didn't deny that Jesus was God in the flesh. Nobody condemned him for that, so I'm assuming he didn't say it because that would have come up. But I think Pelagius would have agreed with Paul that Jesus was a kind of second Adam, that the fully human life of Jesus that the Council of Nicaea affirmed served to prove that the first Adam could in fact have made a different choice, as can we all. Dr. Sarah Miskin, who's a religious scholar now at Brown University, sums up Pelagius' belief in a piece called Sin, Grace, and Ancient Heretics, Revisiting Pelagius, which I quote with her permission. I had a nice back and forth with her this week. Quote, "What's attractive about Pelagius is his unabashed affirmation that human nature is good. He takes God's affirmation that creation is very good from Genesis 1:31 and weaves it throughout his understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to be Christian. Because humans were created in God's image and declared to be excellent by their Creator, Pelagius reasons that human beings must have enormous potential to live into that goodness, which they can do by freely choosing either good or evil. For Pelagius, humans decide who they are going to be via repeated action of truly free choice. God does not interfere with human affairs by bending or shaping our wills. We do that ourselves. Repeatedly following God's law and doing good makes it easier to continue doing so, whereas repeatedly choosing evil makes doing wrong easier and doing good harder. We are, for Pelagius, who we decide to be, and we have full choice in that." She continues, "Now God does interfere in human history to help humans choose the good, first by giving the law. When humanity became so tarnished, it was unlikely they'd ever be able to get back to their state of created goodness, and then by sending Christ. Jesus, as Pelagius describes him, encouraged all of humanity, quote, by his example to pursue perfect righteousness. The blood of Christ does cleanse and wash human beings, enabling a warped will to be unbent and placed at neutral, but human beings still need to make their choices and pursue perfection in following God's will." Close quote. That's a long quote from Dr. Miskin, but it artfully shows how the major forks in the road of Christian theology and belief lead to different outcomes, and how to follow the road from one belief to another. While many of Pelagius' detractors named his issue as running afoul of the Church's doctrine of original sin, Methodism's founder, John Wesley, in the 18th century, connected some dots and said, as we had in the Messenger blurb, quote, "I verily believe the real heresy of Pelagius was neither more nor less than this: the holding that Christians may, by the grace of God, not without it, that I take to be a mere slander, go on to perfection, or in other words, fulfill the law of Christ. Close quote. That first fork is the fundamental nature of human beings after Genesis 3. Is the image of God still in there? Is creation still good? Augustine took the path and the fork that said no, and Pelagius took the fork that said yes. Pelagius' road then hit an obstacle. If humans are, in their truest essence, good, still made in the image of God, no matter what Adam did or didn't do, then what do we do with the obvious fact that people do atrocious things? One answer is that they can't help it. Original sin deprived them of that choice, and that was Augustine's answer. But Augustine said, good news, there's grace, so God will save you anyway. Not so fast, say the signs on the Pelagius fork. Original sin would require that for Jesus to be without sin, he therefore couldn't have been fully human, because all humans are sinful by their nature. And if Jesus had the sin that must come with being fully human, then he couldn't also have been fully God, who can't abide the presence of sin. Yet you have this lovely creed from the Council of Nicaea, which the Roman Empire blessed as the truth of Christianity, insisting that Jesus was indeed both of those things, fully human and fully divine. If it's true that Jesus is fully human and without sin, moreover, if the Bible is right in saying that Jesus was actually tempted to sin, and that was a real and not imaginary kind of temptation, then there must still remain a moral core within all human beings that would allow us to freely choose our actions. If we can't freely choose, then temptation has no meaning, and Jesus' ethical instructions and the entire law of Moses are moot. Anything else leaves the fully human claim about Jesus with an asterisk. Well, he could live that way, but we can't. All of Jesus' teaching is wasted breath, in my view, if that's the case. But that's the next fork in the road. Are human beings free agents, or are our actions predetermined, or some combination? The details of that debate is going to have its own week in this series, but Pelagius and Wesley both took the free will path. And that took Pelagius and later Wesley to the destination that I think was at the root of the real objections they faced. If our human essence still contains all the goodness inherent in the image of God, and if we are also free to choose our actions, then it must be theoretically possible, even though extremely difficult, to always make the choice that Jesus would make in our situation, to live the life that he lived, or, in the words of the ordination question for all United Methodist clergy, to be made perfect in love in this life. I think that inevitable conclusion of following those forks terrified Augustine and many others, because it threatened the return of the existential anxiety about not feeling good enough for God when they tried and didn't find it in themselves to do it. I also think the particular way that Pelagius expressed the belief was insulting, since it implied that those who didn't pick austerity as the way to get their own spirits primed for good choices were lazy. And I don't think that helped his cause any. Just general word of advice, it never helps your cause to insult the person that you're trying to make it to, just as a heads up. But if we're honest, original sin and having everything predetermined does lift a lot of weight off of us. If Pelagius and Wesley are right, then we have to fully and intentionally participate in every minute of our lives. We can't coast except by making Christ-like choices become so well practiced that they begin to come easily and naturally. We have to practice what we preach. We have to walk the walk. We have to not just be the change we want to see in the world, but be the love God placed at the core of our being when the world was begun. Have you tried loving your enemies lately? It is not a cakewalk. It's hard enough to do what we know we should, but complicating matters is that the loving choice is often really, really hard to figure out. Love. Well, yeah, but what does that even mean? What is the loving thing to do in this particular circumstance in which I find myself? Is perhaps the hardest of life's questions. We're frequently confronted with situations that are the result of generations of cruel or negligent choices by actors that are both obvious and hidden. What love looks like in that moment can be hotly debated and not at all obvious, even before we throw in that we ourselves have our own histories. On any given occasion may be tired or mad or in pain or whatever. As ridiculous and offensive as it is to look at a newborn and say, yeah, that's one sinful baby. And that's going to be plain to you the first time she screams, no, in your face. Despite how ridiculous that is, it's still a small price to pay to allow, well, I'm only human, to be a viable excuse for my own behavior later on. I understand that allure. I also understand the judgmental, abusive nature of forcing on someone a moral code they have not chosen, and how the fear of losing the, well, I'm only human excuse can be a substitute for fearing exile from our communities, harsh judgment of many different kinds, or the loss of any number of freedoms. But to return to both Paul and Bonhoeffer, it's exactly that dilemma that makes Romans 3 and the news of God's grace the world-altering gift that it is. If sin were inevitable, if we had no real choice, those acts can hardly be called sin, and forgiving them can hardly be called grace. What kind of monster God would make it impossible for us to do what's good and then pretend to be so magnanimous in forgiving us for it? That's the God of gaslighting, not the God of love. What then are we to say? Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? To me, grace doesn't counter original sin. It wipes the idea of it off the map. I think the fear of thinking perfection is possible is actually a remnant of our fear that God's nature might be wrath rather than love. We are born imperfect, not in the sense of being born bad and sinful, but in the sense of being born as babies, immature and in need of training and guidance. When we make a poor choice and sin, which we will, as inevitably as an infant learning to walk will fall down, God will help us back on our feet and show us what Paul at the end of 1 Corinthians 12 calls a more excellent way. And when that thing that made us fall in the first instance comes at us the next time, we'll have greater and greater ability to remain on our feet. Grace. God's love combined with our sincere effort to reflect God's love back to our Creator with every breath. That is our salvation, our witness, and our joy. Also, Romans has 16 chapters. Amen.